Thank you everyone for joining us. This is Ray Blaylark with Sickle Cell Foundation of Minnesota, and we are back for another session of SickleSMILE. And we first want to make sure that you can see the screen well, because we want to make sure that you understand our SickleSMILE initiative is about finding the fun and healthy things that make us smile and doing more of it. We want to make sure that we thank all of our partners and our sponsors, be the Match, Agios Pharmaceuticals, Children's of Minnesota, as well as the Sickle Cell Data Collection Project that's happening right here in Minnesota. And Sickle Cell Foundation of Minnesota is a partner with the Minnesota Department of Health. So we're very proud of that partnership and what's happening. We are also very proud that this is not just a sickle cell community event. This is about community health. So we have really began doing these cooking classes as a way to promote the use of healthy, non-inflammatory ingredients, something we all need, right? Whether you have an underlying chronic condition or not, some of the things we put in our bodies just simply don't work on our behalf. They don't help us do better. And so we want to give you some ideas and some skills so that you can encourage the use of non-inflammatory ingredients in your everyday cooking. I want to make sure that I introduce you to some pretty awesome individuals. So I'm going to stop sharing just for a moment, and then we will come back and make sure that that you can see the screen again. But I also want to make sure everybody can be heard. So, all right. I want to introduce you to Dr. Kate Shafto, who is an internal medicine and pediatrics physician. She is board certified in integrative medicine, and you will find her at Hennepin Healthcare as well as University of Minnesota. Our other superstar of the show is Jenny Breen. She has a master's in public health, a master's in education. She is a chef by trade as well, works very deeply in food justice, and she is an instructor in culinary nutrition. She works with the University of Minnesota. She also works with Transforming the Table, a nutrition and food services, as a nutrition and food services consultant. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen so that you all can see all of the, not just the amazing graphics, but sometimes it's nice to have some visuals along with everything. So Kate and Jenny, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Ray. I love your introductions. They really get me excited every time. So we're excited to be here as always. And you could go to the next slide since you introduced us. And Kate and I teach a lot of different kinds of classes together, and we feel it's important that we share what we call our core principles, just to give some context and some sense of where we are coming from. And so fundamentally, we believe that what is good for humans' health is good for the planet's health. I would say beyond believing it, we know that to be true. We base our teachings on traditional wisdom concerning foodways, which is supported by research from modern science and generations of cultural knowledge and practice. So it isn't an either or, it's a both and we what happened there? Can you still hear me?
It was a glitch on our part.
Okay. And anyway, so we include both traditional knowledge, we try to, as well as the modern research that we know is so important for informing the information that we share with folks. And these principles that we share are common to every culture. We believe that this is really a human way of understanding and living, and we're just sort of translating that into modern cooking classes. And we teach also with the acknowledgement of our privilege and the humility of many cross-cultural and community-based social and professional experiences. So next, yeah, so what's on the menu? We're excited about this. This was a really fun class to put together. As I'm sure many folks know, Bowls are really popular, and you can find them in all sorts of different kinds of restaurants and places to eat. And they're really sort of a wonderful template for, or a canvas really, for building a meal, because there's so many different ways that you can build them, but there's a lot of great information that is sort of consistent across different kinds of ideas around it, different flavor profiles, different ingredients, depending on what you have and what you like. So that's the theme for today, a delicious and nourishing bowl. And if you, yeah, we will start. And basically we are going to, sorry, we are going to, so sorry, buttons. So we're going to start with the foundations. Before I get into this, though, I want to talk about some of the nutrition principles of the concepts that we are including. So one of the things that we like to just start with is to really talk about whole foods. Ray mentioned anti-inflammatory foods, and that's really sort of the initial premise that we came together around planning these classes. But the reality is that whole foods and eating foods that are sort of in their natural form are really the foundation of all health promoting diets. And so anti-inflammatory is one way of describing those foods. Health promoting is another way, and nourishing and preventative in terms of preventing some of the chronic conditions that I know Kate treats on a daily basis. And so all of these are different reasons why eating whole foods are such an important premise that we start with every time. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you, Ray. I guess I'll start and we can take turns, Kate, if you'd like, but there are basically 3 macronutrients. So in other words, all food is one or a combination of one of these 3 macronutrients. And the first one that I'll talk about is fats. So fats, and when we talk about fats, we're talking about naturally occurring fats, fats that you find naturally in foods in nature. And so that picture in front of you is a wonderful representation of many, not all, but certainly many of the naturally occurring fats. We see fish, we see olives, eggs, cheese and yogurt, nuts, avocados, and even chocolate. So all of those things are really wonderful and delicious examples of great sources of fat, which is an incredibly necessary nutrient for us to be consuming regularly in our diets. Go to the next one, please. You want to talk about proteins?
Proteins, yes. And proteins often overlap with fats. You might notice that eggs are showing up in this, the cheese, the meat or salmon there, fish, some of the seeds and nuts, avocado. So there are also proteins here in those fats, as well as in things like the chickpeas, I believe, are pictured there in the middle. And not to forget that broccoli, vegetables of all kinds have protein. And protein is so important because it helps be the building blocks of muscles and bone and skin tissue, as well as fats. And those two together are so important to come from our diet in whole ways, like Jenny mentioned, that whole ingredient type of way that haven't been super duper processed, because when our body is able to break down those whole foods that we've cooked or we've put together, it breaks them down into the types of building blocks that we need to incorporate into our tissues. When things have been super processed through a lot of industrialized food production, those building blocks really get altered, and then those building blocks are not nearly as healthy or as helpful for our own tissues.
Great. And carbohydrates is the third one. I know when I was growing up and we had the food pyramid, I think it was grains or maybe starches on that. So that might be a more familiar term. Ironically, or more importantly, carbohydrates are not only grains. And I think we were unfortunately really misled to understand that that was the source of carbohydrates in our diet. And for many folks, that became something that probably they consumed more than they might have, that might have been good for them, especially as Kate was talking about the highly processed versions like baked goods and things made from ground up grains as opposed to whole grains. And so, and you can see in this picture, in addition to various whole grains, you'll see lots of fruits and vegetables because they are also sources of carbohydrates. But again, carbohydrates in their whole form contain a lot of fiber. And so that's a really important component of our diet. It's obviously really important for digestion. One of the things that it does, even though carbohydrates are also a natural source of sugars, when you eat whole forms of them, the fiber really slows down the absorption of those sugars, which means that our bodies know how to handle it and how to sort of break it down in ways that give us energy as opposed to make us sick. So that, again, going back to the whole food versions of all of these macronutrients is really sort of the foundation of this anti-inflammatory kind of eating.
Mm-hmm. And there's one that's missing from that picture, which would be dairy, because dairy has carbohydrate, protein in terms of the milk proteins, as well as fat. But when the fat is taken away from the dairy and it's low fat dairy, other things are put in place to stabilize the structure of that food. And that means that the carbohydrates are often more absorbed and less well processed in our digestive system. So there's also carbohydrates in dairy products.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Ray, for the next one. Whole grains, what are they? Whole grain is that picture on the left where it has 3 parts that are very nutrient packed. When grains are refined, which they are in the majority of highly processed or even partially somewhat processed products in the food system, pasta, cereals, baked goods, crackers, pretzels, that kind of thing. The really nutrient dense parts, the bran and the germ, are removed. And so that starchy middle becomes essentially just like easily digestible sugar.
And just to clarify, you can grind up a whole grain into a flour that can become pasta or crackers or whatever, a baked good. And that still does include some fiber. So I want to make sure people understand refinement has many, many steps to it. Mm-hmm. And there are all sorts of ways to sort of to get sort of higher quality or wholer versions and less quality or more refined versions of all of those things. Ideally, we are eating as many of our grains, as we say, intact, meaning they're whole and we haven't really broken them down at all, because then we're getting the most benefit from those grains.
And we have a great digestive system, which includes our teeth and a bunch of digestive enzymes in our mouth, all the way down through our stomach and the intestines, that are designed to break down these different elements of grains and other fiber type foods.
All right. So I think now, and there's we can just go to the bowl now. And maybe we'll start with each of us kind of just showing you all what we have in front of us, because we just decided to do this bowl. We didn't really consult about what each of us were going to put in our bowls. And so there's a variety of ingredients. And that's kind of the fun, I think, of these bowls, is that you really can work with what you have. Mm-hmm. And you can also kind of plan certain parts of it to be used in multiple ways. And so, for example, Kate has a sauce that she made the other day that she's going to use. I've got some ingredients that are left over from other meals. So there's no, you don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to start from zero. And you also don't have to get there's no rules, right? Whatever you have is what you have to work with. These are just sort of suggestions and outlines. So maybe what we can do is we can go to each section, and then before we go on to the next one, Kate and I can each show you what we have from that section.
Sounds
So yeah, we can start back with the first slide about building a bowl. And that is choose your grain. And I would say choose your whole grain, ideally. And there are many, many grains. That list is not a complete list. That's some suggestions. Those are many of the grains that we've used in previous classes. So we've talked about them and we've showed you how we use them. Quinoa, which I believe is
I
what
have on my example. Yeah, still steaming. I just cooked it. This is a red quinoa. You can see how there's a little white curl. Try to get it really close. There's a little white curl. That is the germ that has popped out from the little ball of quinoa that started out dry, and you couldn't see that little white curl. So that means it's cooked, and that is still an intact grain with its 3 parts.
And there's some really fun things, unique things about quinoa. One is that it's a complete protein. So while other whole grains are very nutritious, very few of them are a complete protein, which means they have all the essential amino acids that are really difficult to find in plant foods. So it's a rare plant food in that sense. And it also cooks really fast. So that's just a benefit to quinoa. It takes about 8 minutes. So the same amount of time as white rice would take, with way, way, way more nutritional benefit.
Yes.
Other things we've listed: millet, brown rice, wild rice is what I have. And this is something that I'm showing in my phone view, if you want to show that, Ray, but it's something I had cooked left over from some other meal. And always, I encourage folks when they are cooking to cook more than they might use for one particular meal, so that you can do something like this without having to start, as I said, from scratch. So I've got my cooked wild rice, which is a beautiful local indigenous grain. It is wild, so it's not cultivated by people, but it is harvested by native folks in Minnesota who have the rights to the harvesting of this grain. It's a very elaborate process to harvest, but it's a highly nutritious and highly delicious grain that has a lot of unique characteristics to it. So it's really fun to use. Other grains on this list: barley, farro, which is in the wheat family, oats. Think of oats only as rolled oats, but oats, just like every grain, start off as a whole grain, very similar to looking to something like rice or wheat. And the oats that we're most familiar with are just rolled through a roller. So they still have all their parts, but they're just flattened out, which changes their cooking time and obviously their texture. But you can cook them whole and just eat them like other grains.
And they can be savory as well as sweet, like we think of for most breakfast dishes.
Absolutely. And all of these other grains can be sweet or savory too. There's no, you can't, make a breakfast cereal out of quinoa or millet. In fact, they're delicious in those forms too. So there's lots of versatility with these whole grains too.
I've even made pancakes out of my leftover cooked grains. Really yummy.
There you go. Okay, so starting with the grain. So that's obviously how you might start layering. You certainly don't have to do it this way, but it's kind of nice to put the heavier, thicker things on the bottom. So you can go to the next one. All right, and this is kind of where the creativity and also lots of color. I love how Ray has put the pictures next to each other, and as we go through the slides,
So great.
and I love that because part of how we know when we're getting a diversity of nutrients is those different colors and textures in our food. And so to look at our food and see the thing from red and orange and green to brown and gray is really telling us, oh yeah, I've got a whole bunch of different nutrients and micronutrients and vitamins and even, different kinds of fats and different kinds of proteins. And so it's just a really lovely image. And of course, there is so much flexibility in vegetables. Now, I think both of us are going to be roasting some vegetables. I have some beets and potatoes that I already roasted yesterday that I will be adding. So these are cold because they've already been cooked. And then I have some butternut squash. We'll talk through how I'm going to cut that up before I roast it. Any of the vegetables listed on this list here would be delicious roasted. They would be great sauteed, and many of them would also be fine raw. And, you know, there are different ways to cut things and different ways to prepare them, depending on how you're going to, you know, whether you're cooking them and how you're going to cook them. So, for example, I have a tomato, one of the frost, and I'm not going to cook that. I'm going to put that in raw because that's how I enjoy it most. But squash, while I could cut it really, really thin or grate it and add it raw, I prefer to cook it. I think it's more delicious. And so I've taken a slice of my butternut squash, and I've peeled and sliced it into these kind of rings. And now I'm gonna take my knife, holding my knife, you know, carefully between the blade and the handle, or the blade and the handle, putting my knife stably down. Sometimes I can't use the tip of my knife when I'm cutting something really tall, but in either case, I'm still going to use that really simple, stable form. Start the tip of my knife and then gently squash into these small cubes, because I'm putting them in this bowl, so I don't want them to be in really big pieces. And also because they'll cook relatively quickly that way. So that's how I'm preparing the roasted vegetables. I also have a lot of purple today. I have some purple cabbage and I have a purple radish that is the last of some radishes that someone gave me from their garden. So I'm trying to use things that need to be used up, but that are still the flavors of the seasons.
Okay, before we move forward, you guys know I'm good for asking questions along the way.
Good,
So
good.
I'll start with a question from the audience. Oats, which is healthiest? Quick oats, rolled oats, old fashioned, steel cut oats?
Great question.
I
Well,
think so too.
the steel cut are closer to the whole version. They are the least processed or the least broken down of all that you listed. And so those are going to give you probably the most for what you get. They also obviously take longer to cook. So that's often the case with grains, right? The more whole they are, the longer they cook, but the bigger bang you get for that. You know, there's nothing wrong with the rolled oat version, especially if you have a short amount of time. It's a great whole grain to get into your body. And so it's an excellent thing to include. If you have the time to cook the steel cut oats, go for that.
And you can also make oats overnight. So you could do it in a crock pot with the steel cut oats, or you can soak the oats of any type in yogurt or milk, or even just water with a little bit of acid or salt, and then add your vegetables if it's a savory dish, or add your raisins or cinnamon or that kind of thing in the mix. I do that routinely and take a jar of overnight oats to work with me in the morning.
I'm really glad we had that conversation because I've been intimidated by steel cut oats, right? Because they do take longer. They have a bit different texture, but I know they're healthier for you because they're less processed. So I like the idea about overnight oats. And for those who are attending live tonight, we will send you an email with lots of different resources of the things that we mentioned. And so maybe we'll throw in there, you know, a good overnight oats recipe that we can all do.
That's a great idea. And I would just say again, we make oats and we make oatmeal because that's what we're familiar with, but any grain can be cooked and be delicious that way. And in fact, there are also other grains like barley and rye and rice that can be rolled. And so they can also cook as quickly as rolled oats. We just don't see them nearly as frequently because it's not what in this country, what is familiar.
Right. Okay, and I find that really interesting because I do think that some of what we can do to change not just what we eat, but we have to change our palates, right? We have to introduce new things so that our palate can become adjusted. We're used to the SAD diet, and most of us have taste buds that lean towards the standard American diet or the SAD diet. And it's very sad that that kind of leads how we eat. And so then we end up living to eat rather than eating to live. So I really appreciate that. And so I'm kind of excited about trying some of these other oats. Remember, trying it doesn't mean that you'll like it, but it means that at least you gave yourself a chance to like it. And that's what I used to tell my kids. You don't have to like it, but give yourself a chance to pay. Maybe you'll like it. Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, just one thing you said, flavors, but also textures is something that really used to, because so much of what we have been eating is processed, and so it's already broken down. And so especially I think whole grains are one of those things that is a big transition for some people, because they're chewier, they're tougher, they have fiber, you can taste it, you can feel it. And so, it might take a few tastes, and it might take some really interesting recipes before you find something that really tastes delicious to you.
Well, and you're right, because texture, that's one of the things that my son struggles with. Like, there's no separation between his mind and his taste buds, right? If it doesn't look like the right color, and then if it doesn't have the right taste on his tongue, or the texture is just off, like it shuts everything down. And so I agree, texture is another thing that we have to desensitize. I wouldn't say we have to desensitize ourselves, because we should be able to enjoy it. We just have to introduce new things to our overall palate. Okay, the other question that I was going to ask, because I don't want to slow you guys down or anything, but you mentioned that you cut up your squash, which I think is which is great. And there's so many ways to cook squash. I just want to know, did you grow your squash?
I did not grow this squash, but someone I know did. Actually, I got it from the student organic farm at the University of Minnesota, which they're growing a lot of beautiful squash right now. My garden is not huge, and I decided not to grow those long vines because of, but I don't know, Kate, what are you cooking that you're growing, or that you grew?
Well, great question. I grew these funky looking carrots in our garden with seeds that were 7 or 8 years old that I just found. And I thought, you know what, I'll just plant them. Let's see what happens. And I got carrots. So that was super exciting. I'm going to not cook, but I have these beautiful little tomatoes still from our tomato plants. And then I also pulled out some chopped green onions. I'll show you that and show you on the camera here. So I pulled these out of the freezer. So we had so many green onions that I couldn't use them all before they would, wilt and fade and go bad. So I chopped them up and put them in a little baggie, which I still have here, like a little parchment bag, and labeled it green onions, and put it in a plastic Ziploc with a bunch of those little parchment bags so that I could just pull out a portion of green onions. And so I'm using that for my onions. And then I grew beets. So this is a partially chopped beet, and I'm going to use the beet greens as well in our saute. I'm going to do a saute of greens as part of the bowl. And then I think that might be it for what we grew for this bowl.
And of greens, I also, actually, I do have kale from my garden, but I decided I'm going to put this in raw just to show folks. I have some local hydroponic lettuce, but I like a little more chewiness in my salad sometimes. And so I'm going to take my kale off these stems and just slice it very, very thinly. When I use raw kale or other raw, cooking greens, which I think is fine to do, I like to really cut them small and also give them a little bit of a massage or just a little bit of a working so that tenderized, because I think it's another deterrent if we eat serve things that are strong and bitter and tough textured all at the same time. So I like to make these a little less tough, and that's one way to do it.
So I'll just show folks how I'm handling these vegetables, which I plan to roast. So I'll be roasting my carrots. You could do carrots raw. I just wanted to roast them. And beets I'm going to roast. And then I also have some Brussels sprouts, which I didn't grow, but I'm going to just finish chopping these on camera. I chopped the other ones in the bowl right there before we started. So as for the carrots, you could cut them in half like that to have a flat surface, and then chop them in little discs or little half discs. So I can continue to do that. And when they're kind of knobby and twisted like this, it can help to cut them into smaller sections so that you're not managing the curves quite as much. And as Jenny mentioned before with the squash, I'm chopping these into relatively similar width pieces so that they're going to cook at a similar rate. With the beets, I already did some chopping of my beets. You can see there into little cubes, more or less. And again, principle would be to make yourself a flat surface so you're not chasing your beet around, rolling all over the place. And then I like to make a couple of cuts with my fingers over top of the vegetable. I think people can see that, so that I'm kind of holding it all together. And that kind of keeps it together. And I turn it around the opposite direction and slice this way.
Similar to cutting onions at times.
You could do that for cutting anything kind of round and that you want into smaller pieces.
So let's talk a little bit, because I do think, and I'm sorry for cutting you off, but beets, can you explain the flavor profile of beets? Number one, because some of us have never, ever had a beet.
Yep.
But also the benefits that might be to the blood, which I think ties in, perfectly to kind of the theme of this show.
For sure. So beets, I had never had a beet until maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I think if I had ever had a beet, it was probably a canned beet, which I wouldn't recommend as your first exposure to beets. So beets are very sweet, especially when roasted. So I'm going to combine this bowl of beautiful beets. They are not only red, but other beets can be a striped color, striped like pink and white, or yellow. And so beets in general, when roasted especially, are quite sweet because the starches caramelize as the water is drawn out. And that happens through salt and heat, which is conducted by the oil that I just drizzled over.
And that's what I was going to ask you, is what you just added to the bowl.
Yeah, I just added some olive oil and some salt and pepper, and kind of enough. I don't measure it. I just drizzle it enough so that it's not pooling at the bottom of the bowl, but it's kind of getting all the little pieces covered. And then the salt and pepper, or you could put other spices as well, garlic, cumin, turmeric, anything like that. So that's all kind of coating the individual little squares or rectangles of the beets. Awesome. And the flavor profile can also be a bit earthy. So yes, it's sweet, but I would say it's sweet to a palate that's familiar with vegetable sweetness. It's not sweet like a donut. It's not sweet like honey, but it's sweet in the vegetable kingdom. And it does have kind of it can have a toughness because it's a root vegetable and roots are hard, but all of that is really softened and nicely changed by the cooking process. Sometimes beets are like shaved on a salad or made into a soup. There's a tradition of borscht, which I don't really know all the ingredients of. It's a creamy, like more of a liquid pureed beet soup. Health benefits, I would say, are many because of the strong color that Jenny mentioned before in, many of these things that are sitting on our tables. But the colors indicate antioxidants and vitamins. And so there is a tremendous amount of antioxidant power in these brightly colored, especially the deep dark colored vegetables. And that's very good for our bloodstream, for our inflammation, because antioxidant molecules that we consume through food, they combat inflammation, and especially what's called reactive oxygen species, or particular elements of the immune system or the body's reaction to inflammation that are unstable. And so that unstable molecule called a reactive oxygen species does damage to our cells and our tissues. Antioxidants in our food, in our body, can really help to tamp down that level of inflammation.
And one thing I'll add just about cooking with beets, they are this incredibly dark red color, which I think can be both appealing or intimidating depending on, you know, the person and the context. But when you cook them, they quote unquote bleed, which is interesting since they're also so good for your blood, but they bleed. And so I have learned often, especially when I'm presenting a platter, for example, of roasted vegetables, I've learned to roast them separately so that the other vegetables don't get colored by the beets. So
you can see on my cutting board, there's
they're like, you'd think that they make food coloring from them. They're pretty strongly colored.
You can dye things in beet juice. It's that strong. So you can see my potatoes don't look pink because I roasted them separately from my beet. And I think it doesn't really matter in the end if they bleed, but there is something about that visual, that beautiful aesthetic of all the bright colors of the vegetables that I really enjoy, especially when we're composing something like a bowl that's really going to show that off.
Right. And I'll just say finally with my Brussels sprouts, if you've never roasted a Brussels sprout, that might also be intimidating. They're like little tiny cabbages, but they're a lot easier to work with than a big cabbage. I also have a big cabbage right here, and you can kind of see, or a part of a big cabbage, they have some similar contours and leaf layering. So these are just all little leaves that make up the Brussels sprouts, the little head of the Brussels sprouts, like a little cabbage. I like to cut the very bottom off that's a bit dry, and then I just cut it in half. And if it's a really big one, I cut it in half again. So again, like to make it into quarters. And there it is with the beet juice on it from my knife. So I'm going to finish doing that and then get all these things into the oven so that they can start roasting, so that I'll be able to put them together with the rest of the bowl.
And I will, I'll show you, I'm just starting to build the bowl as we talk, just for fun. So I've got the wild rice, I've got both my lettuce and the very thinly cut kale, so 2 different shades of green here, and then I've got my potatoes and beets. That's in the and it's really fun. It's like kind of, you know, painting or creating some sort of an image, because you can really play with the colors and the textures and the shapes and stuff like that. So I definitely encourage folks to have fun with it. Do, you know, set up your mise en place, get everything that you need in place before you, just so that you have enough room. I actually think I could use a big bowl because I have so many things to put in it. But it's fun to just start putting things together. But before I move on with that, I think we'll go to the next slide, which is, I think, the protein, just so we can keep talking about what can go into the bowl.
Mm-hmm.
So next piece is the protein piece. And again, you don't necessarily have to go in this order, but it is sort of proportional. So protein examples are also kind of endless. We've talked a lot of different proteins in the different classes that we've done here, but certainly beans and legumes are a wonderful source of protein, and affordable one, and a very versatile one. So, and I just listed a few. There are many: black beans, black-eyed peas, lentils, chickpeas. I think last month I made the chili out of this beautiful local, it's called Tiger's Eye bean, that I got at the farmer's market from a local Hmong grower. So the varieties are endless. And just like with grains, when I cook beans, I cook more than I for just one meal, and then I have them on hand. So I might have these already cooked in the fridge, and I can just throw them right onto my bowl. Other proteins, nuts and seeds, as we mentioned, are both a fat and a protein, but obviously they add tons of flavor, texture. Chicken, shrimp, shellfish, fish of any kind, tofu, which I think we've worked with here before, and tempeh, which is another soybean protein, traditional from Indonesia. Eggs, another one. I actually have some eggs that I am going to cook and put on top of my bowl, and cheese. So those are all proteins. Many of these proteins have other macronutrients as well. And they're all really great options for what you can put into your bowl. Today, I have, and I'll show you this in my small camera, I have some sausages that I had in my freezer, and I just pulled them out this morning. And these come from a really wonderful local turkey farm called Ferndale Market. So they're in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, and they're a family-run farm. They've been there for several generations, and they sell turkey, but they also sell some different turkey products like these sausages. I love them because they're really flavorful, but also just I choose generally poultry over red meat when I'm eating meat, and so this is a great option. So I'm just they're already cooked, obviously, but I'm just gonna heat them through and brown them a little bit, and then I'll cut those up, and those will be my protein today, along with my eggs, of course. And Kate, I think, what are you putting on for your protein?
My protein is going to be the vegetables, because all of them have protein, the quinoa, and then I also will have these beautiful mushrooms as my protein. So mushrooms are a fungi, they're a vegetable, they're a protein source, they're just kind of amazing. So these are oyster mushrooms, and these are also from a local grower. And there's a couple of great mushroom growers in the area locally. And oyster mushrooms, shiitake mushrooms, they are definitely more expensive than the typical crimini or button or even portobello mushrooms, but something to consider. They're very nutrient dense, and best to cook mushrooms kind of across the board. I know it's common to see a salad bar with raw mushrooms. I've learned from a variety of nutrition expert folks that study nutrition as well as fungi, that it's really best, especially with the button mushrooms, to cook them, but all mushrooms really should be cooked. And I think I don't know, Jenny, I didn't think about this before the program tonight, but do you know what the background is of why it's recommended to cook mushrooms?
You know, it's a good question. I wonder if some of the nutrients, some of the protein maybe isn't as accessible when they're raw. I certainly know from a culinary standpoint, the texture, like you just don't get the texture and the tenderness
right
from a mushroom to cooked one. But that's
exactly. Yeah, but that'll be something I can report back next time, what the details are on why it's recommended to cook mushrooms. But really nice for protein, also for, again, nutrients that come from this sort of special category of food, which is fungi, and can function in a very similar way as meat. It has a similar feel, they call mouth feel. So it's pretty hearty and a bit chewy also. I like to cook mine pretty slow and in olive oil, especially that I've been marinating with garlic, or I've been soaking my garlic in the olive oil just to kind of infuse it. I can't get it under the camera.
But I think that what you mentioned, Kate, the cost of many of these foods, especially the foods that are taking the place of meat, when we think about foods that we use instead of using meat that deliver as much or more nutritional value anyway, then thinking about the cost becomes a little bit of a different calculation. And I think it's really hard I was just having a conversation with a farmer today, and we were talking about if you shop at the co-op, the natural foods co-op, or even the farmer's market, the same way that you shop maybe at the grocery store, it won't work out, right? You have to think differently about the whole foods that you're buying and the quantities, choices that you're making in order for it to be cost effective. However, it can be very cost effective. So it's just a matter of kind of understanding some of those choices and when to make them. And mushrooms are a really wonderful example because they both contain so much nutritional value and also really can mimic the texture of meat that people really enjoy.
And to mention again, the farmers market as a way to really get very good quality local food. And there is a Market Bucks program where EBT and SNAP dollars are doubled or tripled depending on the program. And there are markets all throughout the winter. You just need to do a little bit of research to find out where the one might be closest to you.
Yeah, so the Minnesota Farmers Market Association has a website, as does the Minneapolis Farmers Market Collaborative, and both of them have great information about markets and where they are and when they are. The Minnesota Grown program, which is part of the Department of Agriculture, also has a really great website. You can find farmers markets. You can also find, where to go pick apples and other, pumpkins and such. So there's great information out there, but you kind of have to look, but it's worth it. Okay, Ray, I'm going to have you go back to our slide. So we just talked about the protein, and my sausages are cooking over here. And I'm going to have you go to the next one. And that one that's a really fun one. We started off the whole conversation about with fat. And of course, fat is, as from both a chef perspective and a nutrition perspective, is one of my favorite macronutrients because fat it has a lot of functions in both places. From a nutritional perspective, a high quality, naturally occurring fat is really satisfying. So it's the kind of thing that we don't have to really worry about, and we don't have to stress about, we don't have to measure, because it's really satisfying, so we don't consume huge amounts of it. It's also obviously a really important part of flavor. So fat is really where a lot of the flavor is in all foods. And so it's really important that we use it when we're making food so that it tastes really good and so that we want to eat the things that we're making. And then it does this thing of sort of distributing that flavor around to everything that it's on or everything that it's cooked with, and conducting the heat or the flavor that you're trying to spread around. So fat has all of these really important functions, not to mention that it's vital for absorbing certain fat soluble vitamins and just sort of, feeding some of the cells in our brains and bodies. So it's incredibly important that we get that fat, and the quality and the kind of fat is equally important. And so when we're making a sauce, when we're creating the flavor for our bowl or for anything we're making, we want to make sure that fat is kind of the foundation of that. And so in this slide, there's just a list of ideas of ways that you can use sauces and fats. But this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are so many different things you can do. And we will talk about a few that we have created or will create. But again, the list is really kind of endless. So, and some of these are not super fatty either. So a salsa is actually a pretty low fat sauce in general. Miso sauce, which miso is an Asian ingredient that I think I've used in a previous class. But I would use, for example, something like a toasted sesame oil, which is a fat, or an olive oil as a base for something like that. So a lot of African flavor profiles include different peppers and different, spices in the pepper family. And that would also potentially be a base of olive oil, or we found some recipes that included mayonnaise, which again is just basically eggs and oil. So again, a fat source. You could use other kinds of creamy things like yogurt or sour cream or creamy soft cheeses in that kind of a sauce.
Or like tzatziki sauce is a Greek inspired yogurt based sauce.
Right, that's a great example. And that would just be like yogurt, maybe with some fresh dill or fresh herbs, some cucumbers, nut butter or tahini. So we've talked about different nuts and seeds as great sources of protein and fat. And then when they are ground up into a nut butter or tahini, they're also a really great foundation for a sauce because they can be a great creamy element and also add all of that nutritional content. And then avocado, another one of my favorite fats. I think a lot of people really love avocado, and you can just add avocado, obviously, as an ingredient, but it's also just a wonderful texture to use as a foundation for a sauce. Probably many people have had guacamole, which is traditional Mexican food. But you can use, avocados are eaten in many parts of the world and they can be used with lots of different flavors. So these are just multiple different ideas for how to build a sauce using some really great fats. And the sauce that I'm going to create is using toasted sesame oil. This is a really dark, nutty oil from sesame seeds, from toasted sesame seeds, and then an olive oil. And I think maybe in our first class, Ray, we did a basic salad dressing formula. And I'm basically using that same formula with this sauce. I'm just, using a few different ingredients than maybe I did in that particular sauce, just for fun. But you could literally do, I've got my 2 oils in here. I'm adding some mustard. So this is just stone ground mustard. You can use Dijon, you can use whatever, yellow mustard, anything that you have, but it's got a little bit of that sort of acid vinegary flavor and a little bit of bitterness, which is a really nice component in a sauce. And then I am going to use, this is tahini. So this is made from sesame seeds. It's just like peanut butter, only it's made from sesame seeds. It's a little thinner than peanut butter is, but if peanut butter is what you have or what you like, or if you have almond butter, or if you have cashew butter, any of those would work well. Tahini is nice because it is a little thinner, and so it really works well for a sauce that you want to pour. So I'm mixing those together. Now, if I wanted, I could take this avocado and mash it right into my dressing and just use that as part of my sauce. Or I can cut it up and put it into my bowl. I'm going to take just a little bit of maple syrup because I like just a little sweet to balance out that bitterness and that tartness from the acid. But again, all of this is up to you and your interpretation and what you have and what you like. I'm putting salt in because I do want to bring out all the flavors, and salt is a really important element in doing that. And that's basically sauce. I do, one more thing I have is pesto, and I know Kate has some pesto too. Yep. So when it was sort of peak herb season, I took my basil, I also took some of my oregano, I took some spinach, some arugula, even my carrot greens, and I ground that up with garlic and nuts and olive and turn that into pesto. And then I just put it in little blobs on a sheet pan and stick it in my freezer until it gets nice and solid. And then I just throw, just like Kate did with her onions, I'll just throw those into a big Ziploc bag in my freezer. And then I just can pull out a hunk of pesto. Usually it will thaw very quickly. I can cut it up into pieces. I can mix it into something hot, or I can let it thaw and then use it as a creamy element in a sauce or something like that. So that's another just fun thing to pull out. Pesto is yet another great source of fat with the nuts and the oil in it. So lots and lots of different ways to build a sauce pretty simply. I'm gonna check my squash. I forgot I had it in the oven.
Good.
Looking pretty good.
No, I don't know if it's possible to get on my food view, and if that's looking okay. I changed my camera to my stove. Yeah, kind of. Thing there. So you just see my quinoa. Okay, so over here, got. So yeah, got my 2 cast iron pans. One, I just cooked the mushrooms with a little bit of garlic, and I had my garlic soaking in olive oil. So I just like how that goes. It smells really nice. And now I'm going to cook my greens, and I have these greens here. You can see in this bowl some collard greens, some thinly sliced cabbage, which I like to cook on the stove top. I'm going to use my my little onions that I took out of the freezer. And once my oil is kind of on the warm side, I'll add those things in. And then my other greens, which is a mixture of the beet greens and some chard and even some carrot greens. So any and all of the greens can be a part of a vegetable saute. Salt is another important ingredient in cooking with vegetables, because first of all, they don't have any salt in them naturally, or not much anyway. And so adding salt really helps to draw out flavor. We actually need salt in our diet, and it's been another nutrient, if you will, that's been villainized, I think. But really the problem in our food system with salt is all the ways it's used as a preservative or as kind of altered artificial salts like monosodium glutamate, which is common in some Chinese food, though I think there's been more attention to that being really problematic for a lot of people in more recent years. But it's known to be very toxic to the nervous system. So not a really ideal salt form to have in your diet. When we're cooking vegetables and other things from scratch, we need to add salt for the sake of the flavor and the chemistry of it all. And we don't need to worry about having too much salt, because when we add it ourselves, we can be in control of how much salt we have. And it's kind of impossible to over consume salt if we're adding it and tasting along the way. You can definitely over add salt if you're not careful about how much you're adding, and it won't be palatable because it will taste way too salty. But in terms of recommended amounts of salt, you're not going to exceed that if you're just using salt in day-to-day cooking. So important to mention.
Is there a particular, and I'm sorry, I missed a little bit of what you said, but different salts, like, a couple years ago, I started using pink Himalayan salt. Like, I removed all of the table salt, any iodized salt in my house. I like literally got rid of it. and so now sea salt and pink Himalayan salt are what I use the most of. I know that the consistency is different for each of them, and the coarseness is different.
Yep.
Anything else that should be noted about the different types of salts?
Well, I can definitely let Jenny speak to that, because there are a lot of different salts in terms of the culinary reasons. And when it comes to the iodized salt, that is a source of iodine, which is essential for the thyroid gland. But it's not nature's source of iodine. Iodine is much more found in sea vegetables and such, so seaweed and shellfish or fish.
Salt.
And what?
And sea salt.
And sea salt, sure. But then, so sea salt comes from the sea, Himalayan salt comes from the Himalayas. And there's been a lot of, again, marketing can make some of these things a lot more like shiny than just their humble origins of being salt, different types of salt. Some of the salts have trace minerals that are not found in kind of your typical iodized table salt. I think there's also some concern that there may be some anti-caking agents added to some sort of lower quality salt. But Jenny, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I know many chefs who really, you know, play with and utilize a variety of sea salts or the Himalayan salt also come from salt mines, right? So they're natural from the earth salts. So my feeling is those are the salts that we should be using, is what we're getting from the earth without alteration, just like we're talking about any other whole food. Culinarily, sure, there's subtle differences or even distinct differences. You can get really into the detail of it. I am by no means sophisticated around my salt. I'm pretty simple with salt, although I have tasted really interesting and wonderfully flavored salt. So I think it's fine to play with it. It's not worth, if you're concerned about cost, it's not worth spending a lot more money on some of the salts when there are other places I think it's more worth putting your money.
Yep, agreed.
So I guess the question then kind of becomes, considering the average consumption of salt in any given household, the average, is it best to avoid table salt or iodized salt, or is it best to just be mindful about how much of it you're using and give yourself some alternatives?
Are you asking for the sake of having too much salt in your diet issue?
Yeah, I mean, and not just too much salt, but having the right kind of salts. There are, culturally speaking, the difference in seasonings or the amounts of seasonings. We talked about palate, so you can become very accustomed to having that salt taste. And so you have to be mindful of the type of salt that you're using, as well as the amount of salt that you're using.
I would say for the sake of, as it's kind of been popularized that a high salt diet leads to high blood pressure and cardiovascular issues. That's really not the case if you're just using whatever salt in your home cooking. The problem is when you're eating fast food and chips and highly processed food that uses salt as a preservative in the form of sodium sodium monosodium glutamate, these sort of preservative type salts, or like really salted, frequently like deli meats or highly processed meats have a lot of that sodium content, which is different than just salting your food when you're cooking on the stove or in a roast or in home cooking.
What you just said is really important, because, sometimes you can get, your taste buds change because of the type of food that you're eating, particularly around processed foods.
They do.
And so it's not necessarily what you're using at home, it's what's in the food that you're putting in your body, particularly when you're eating, like you said, fast food or heavily processed food. So great point.
Of cooking at home is that you have 100% control about what goes into your food. So unless you're using, packaged seasonings or packaged ingredients, you maybe still know what's in them. If you're using all, really going to be detrimental. That's the salt that's, an appropriate amount for flavor and for your needs, right? So it's less about which kind of table salt and more about where you're getting your salt overall.
This is that awesome discussion. I think this is really helpful. Because salt has been snuck into our diets in so many ways. And then you get the opposite messaging of salt is terrible for you. We're consuming too much salt. And you're like, yeah, but nobody's cutting down on the salt they put in the foods we buy.
Well, and you buy low salt things, and people start, it becomes a whole marketing strategy, right? Point out that, hey, guess what? This oatmeal is low salt. Like, well, it should be, right?
Right.
So there are so many layers to the messaging that is really meant to confuse you, right? Because you're the consumer. And as long as you don't fully understand, you probably just keep buying what you're used to it, or because it tastes good, right? When things are really salty and sugary, they taste good, right? We're drawn to those flavors. And so if we're really used to those flavors, it is hard to transition to more naturally flavored things.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And there's a fascinating book, if anyone's really interested in diving deep into the food industry, called Salt, Sugar, Fat by Michael Moss. And very revealing book.
Very revealing. He goes deep into the food industry and how it really strategically and very intentionally,
Mhm.
manipulates and creates in a lab the flavors that people become addicted to.
Wow. So for those who are attending live who may not know it, I will send out an email tomorrow with, again, all of the different things that we've discussed here. So far, we're going to talk about in the email overnight oats, the Minnesota Grown website, and all of the other farmers market resources, a little bit, and then the book by Michael Moss will include the information about that as well.
And Ray, I know that we're going to wrap a little bit early, so there's a few more things I wanted to show. These are those beautiful radishes that I'm trying to use up. And I think it's really fun to remember, and I think that there's a photo on the last slide that has some beautiful radishes on the top of it. But I think it's really, again, fun to remember that part of the joy of eating these whole foods is the physical beauty, I think, the aesthetic of it. And you might as well have fun with that. So I think for this bowl, I'm going to cut these in really thin little strips so I can kind of use them as a bit of a decoration around the top. And I think that last slide talks about kind of extra toppings and textures. And so getting back to talking about textures, nuts and seeds can also add texture. You can sprinkle sesame seeds or some crushed nuts, dry fresh fruit. That's something a lot of people like in their bowls and their salads. Kimchi and fermented foods. We talked, I think, previously about how incredibly important that bacteria is for the gut. So it's both a really powerful flavor addition and also a really great nutritious addition. Nutritional yeast is just another version of vitamin B that is non-dairy, so and non-animal. So it's got an interesting flavor if people want to explore that. And then other things like herbs or sprouts or, sort of small leafy things that can add flavor and texture. So those are just ideas. I'm sure people can think of more. I've got some toasted pumpkin seeds from previously from, I don't remember when, but at some point I made a squash or pumpkin and I cooked these so I can sprinkle those on top. And I just, in the interest of time, I kind of put my bowl together. So I've got sausages are sliced here. I've got that squash that I roasted and my beets and potatoes, my greens, my rice, and my beautiful little purple radishes. And I could just keep going. And then I can drizzle my sauce on. And, there we have it. And that's the fun kind of thing about this activity is that it's really just wherever you're moved to take it with what you have. And again, what you feel like having.
I think that is so beautiful. One of the things that you said that stands out to me every time, and this is what really made me begin to change, right? It's a process. I'm still changing, but it's about the more colorful your plate is, right? Mm-hmm. Whole foods are so colorful. And you kind of know when you're on the right track when your plate is naturally colorful. And that's the beauty. I mean, these vibrant, the oranges, the greens, the yellows are so vibrant, and it's like this pure color that comes, from the ground. So, I mean, the plate that you just created was beautiful. And I can't wait to see Kate's plate because I know it will be equally as beautiful.
I'll also add just another fun thing, and this, I did this and I did it as a demonstration, but another thing that's really fun about this kind of thing, I'm always thinking about how to engage kids and folks who maybe aren't as involved in the cooking or the eating as you might want. And I often will, with my kids, well, they're not here anymore, but when they were here, would set up all of these things across the counter table in separate bowls, and everybody could assemble their own. And there's something really exciting for kids about being able to do that. And they're learning how to make choices, but they're also seeing all the different colors and components and getting familiar with them. And in the end, I think that they choose more than you would think to put into their bowls. And so I think it's a great way to expose kids to ingredients, to give them some control, and to make it fun and engage them in the process.
I love everything about what you just said about that. And it just gave me a flashback to when my kids were younger. One of the things I would do, especially around the Halloween, oh, Kate, I see it, especially around Halloween, is I would use it. I would have these bowls that were about hand and finger texture, they would be blindfolded for Halloween. And then I had these other bowls of things to taste. And can you name what it is, right? And what a way to introduce it. But it's about interactive, getting them involved in it and exploring. So I love what you said about really setting it up as a bar, a food bar, right? And they feel like they have more control over their plate, but they're exposed to more. So that's fantastic.
All right, Kate, let's see your bowl.
I've got my bowl here with my quinoa. You can barely see it. I'll point with my knife here. Like the quinoa is poking out from underneath my carrots, and my roasted carrots, my roasted beets, some of the greens poking through the tomatoes on top with the pumpkin seeds, and my mushrooms are under there as well, as well as a bit of the tahini dressing that I made the other day.
And by the way, I love quinoa. The first time I had quinoa was on a kale and quinoa salad with there was a protein on there, and I think that it was some kind of fish, most likely, because I love fish. But and I was surprised at how appetizing it was. It was a pleasant surprise.
Good. Yes.
Yeah.
It was salmon. That's what it was. I had salmon on there, and it was delish. And I think there was cranberries in there or something like that. But it tasted better than I would have assumed that it tasted, and I was glad that I tried it.
Nice.
Great.
So, wow, what an amazing
evening.
And look at that. Like the amount, obviously we did talking, we did some chopping and things like that, but this is a quick meal for the average family, right? And even though you can have as many or as least ingredients as you want, the ingredients that you can choose are pretty easily accessible. Some of them are items you can grow yourself or pick up at your local farmer's market. I heard you drop a resource in, and that is, EBT. If you get EBT, you're going to get double the credit. You can double the amount of worth when you use your EBT at a farmer's market. So that's just fabulous. That's like free money and free food. So I'm so glad that we did this, because creativity is half the battle. Right. And just being able to creatively build something from whole foods is fantastic. And it's beautiful. How impressed would my family have been had I did something like this? They would have been like, wow. And that feels kind of good. So it doesn't matter who you are, you can do it.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's also empowering to know that you may have these things around your house and there's a way to put them together, that it doesn't require, a higher level cooking skills or even a recipe per se, but just kind of this template or this pattern of putting together a whole grain. You could use brown rice, some beans, so many different cultures and different variations of this for anybody's flavor profile and ingredients that they may have at home.
Well, I love it. Let's talk a little bit about the food guide, and then we'll close it out for those of you who every time I do the show, I'm so hungry at the end. I seriously, one day I'm going to show up in the same camera as one of you.
Good. Please do. I hope so. I hope so.
Okay, so let's talk about this Canadian food guide and why we like to use it.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's beautiful. Like you were saying before, it's beautiful with all the different colors. And I think it really does a nice job of kind of showing the proportions. I like that it's pictures. I like that water is the drink of choice. And that they talk about whole grain foods and give a variety of options, a variety of proteins like we discussed, and then plenty of fruits and vegetables. I would say that the fat piece is missing there, but no food guide is perfect. And there are significant overlaps between the protein and the fat category, which are represented there.
I love it. Okay, next one, mindful eating.
So important, so important.
Yeah, we were kind of laughing about this because it looks just like the food plate, the USDA except that it has very different information on it. But essentially, we always, we talked about how beautiful our food was, and that's one of the first ways that we start to get ready to digest our food is just by our other senses being stimulated. And so making sure we are taking a moment to take a breath, to let our body know that it's time to absorb nutrients, that it doesn't have to be in protective mode, and to really honor the time of sitting with our food and nourishing ourselves and sharing that with others or doing it on our own, either way, but just sort of acknowledging and taking the time to make sure that we recognize that we deserve nourishment and we deserve to take the time to really feed our bodies and enjoy our food.
I love this. I think that, just being more mindful, period, leads you down this path, right? Yep. And so I think that's what's beautiful and natural about, what we're doing here. Mm-hmm. Let's just say I am so pleased. I do want to make sure that you all know that within about 24 hours, you can catch the replay of this session. For those of you who are watching on our YouTube channel, you are already watching the replay. So you may not have the benefit of some of the perks of being live when we recorded it, but that's okay. I also want to make sure that next month, so in November, we will be having our next session. Instead of having our session on the 4th Tuesday of the month, we will move it to the 3rd Tuesday, so November 15th. And we will have kind of a Thanksgiving idea theme, but we want to make sure that you have the week of Thanksgiving with your family. Maybe you can take some of the things you've learned over the past several months, and you can apply it to your Thanksgiving. So November 15th, we'll make sure everything is updated. So don't forget, you can register now, but we will not have a session in December, and we will update all of our previous attendees regarding sessions in the new year. And then, of course, we are Sickle Cell Foundation of Minnesota. We want to make sure that we say thank you to our special guest, Dr. Kate Shafto, as well as Jenny Broccoli Breen. I don't know why I just love saying Jenny Broccoli. I don't know. It just is fun. If you have specific questions for either Dr. Shafto or for Jenny, you can feel free to email us at events@sicklecellmn.org. That's also the email that you will receive your day after follow-up resources from. You can follow us, Sickle Cell MN, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. And if you're a TikTok kind of person, but you're not going to see me doing TikTok dances or anything like that, not yet. We're going to find the young people to go do that. But we appreciate you following us. Again, just another reminder that if you are looking to see a little bit more in-depth conversation about, it does say sickle cell and nutrition, but we are really talking about nutrition and community health, good health. And so please don't let that defer you. but you can watch that on our YouTube channel as well. And then you can, again, sign up for our future monthly virtual classes. In this case, we have next month's class already up. We do not have any classes for 2023 up yet, but keep an eye out. And then I never pass up the opportunity to remind people that we are in a critical blood shortage, and we cannot encourage you strongly enough to go and donate blood. We know that only about 3 to 5% of the population actually donates blood. And the fact is, more of us are eligible than we might convince ourselves. So yes, you may have an underlying condition. Yes, you may have other things going on, but that may not mean you can't donate. So just double check, but we could really use it. And I always say this, you know, if you really want to lend a hand, then lend an arm, okay? And then, of course, be the match. And this is very specific to sickle cell disease. There is a cure. Not many people may be aware of it in the broader community, but there is a cure, and Be the Match is right there to help make that happen. But we do need to, just like the blood supply, we need to diversify the blood supply. We need people of all ethnic backgrounds, but particularly in the ethnic backgrounds that we just don't see enough of. And of course, that is Black and brown people, that is people of color. But I'm specifically speaking to people who can do that and help to be a lifeline to someone else, because we are the cure. So join the registry. And then last but not least, because we are a patient advocacy organization, it does not matter your diagnosis. We want to hear from you. We want you to know that your voice does matter in the patient advocacy community. We want to know about your story. We want to know about your experiences, both good and bad. So you can follow our website to get more information, or you can go directly to the form that allows you to fill it out. And other than that, we thank you for joining us for SickleSMILE and choosing fun and healthy things that make you smile and doing just a little bit more of it. So we're so glad that you joined us today, and we hope to see you next month. Don't forget to sign up and check out our previous episodes. Tell your friends and family. Promote it on your social media. We want this. This is open to the community. It's not about any one particular diagnosis or one particular organization. This is where we come together as a community to address community health, and we're glad that you're here. So thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Bye, everyone.